Okay, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, rather. Just waiting for everyone to join us. All right. Well, welcome, everyone. Welcome to one of the first sessions for the Seed Conference. We are so happy and glad to have you with us. And we're very happy that you've chosen to join us for this session, the 4 p.m. session, which is a Resilient Seed Community, which will be moderated by Hannah Traggis et al. This workshop, or actually session meetup, is part of the 2021 Northeast Organic Seed Conference. I'd like to let everyone know that we are recording this session, so just to let you know. The NOFA New York Winter Conference and the Northeast Organic Seed Conference join together every 2 years. And you are participating in the third collaboration, which is wonderful. Please enjoy and get to as many workshops at this dual online conference as possible during the week. I have gone to a few and they were great. My name is Anna Muhammad, and I actually garden and work in Springfield, Massachusetts, your neighbor to the east. I am the Equity Director and Food Access Coordinator for NOFA, Massachusetts. I work with community gardens and youth groups in the Springfield area. And it's really my pleasure to open this workshop. I will be assisting as the Zoom tech host for this session. So if you need any tech assistance, you can use the chat and let me know. And another time, we would have been together at a conference such as this, somewhere in a conference center or hotel after a long drive or a flight or even a train ride. We would have been bleary-eyed, a little sleepy. But to be sure, Zoom over this next week will make us a little bleary-eyed. We've all made the most of a very difficult time and made the choice to share this afternoon together. Without greeting hugs to old friends, without handshakes and in-person hellos to newly met comrades, we are all here, willing to touch the minds and hearts of others with learning and knowledge. So before we begin, I have a few housekeeping things to go over. First, we want to start with our community agreements. They are on the screen now for you to view. We'd like all of our conference participants to abide by these agreements. I'm not going to go through all of them. Please read what you see on the screen, and also they're in the socio handbook or program book for the conference. Please go over them throughout the conference. This is how we keep our workshop spaces and keynote spaces safe, free, open for everyone to enjoy the wonderful information we're going to get. I'm just going to pull out a few highlights. One mic, so one voice at a time. So if you ask a question, ask your question and put yourself back on mute. Please keep yourself on mute. If you use any jargon or any acronyms, you're hearing NOFA Mass, NOFA New York, go ahead and spell that information out. And then really most importantly, be patient. We are all on virtual platforms. Technology sometimes does not always agree or cooperate, and we're navigating this together. So just be patient and we all work together. And just as a little tip to increase the bandwidth for everyone for the workshop, if you are not presenting or speaking, if you can keep both your sound on mute and your screen, turn your video off, you can do both of those by using the feature at the bottom. It might be the bottom of your screen, bottom left, or it might be on the right or at the top to turn those things off. That way we can optimize the experience for everyone. One thing I want to mention is land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge the land that we live on that was managed and lived on previously by our indigenous family before European colonization. I am broadcasting from Pecumtuck land, which is Springfield, Massachusetts. What you see now on the screen is a map with a link that will help you locate what indigenous family actually was in the area that you're living on now. I'll put that in the chat and you can refer to that. If you'd like to know what indigenous community lived where you are now, go ahead and take a look at that map. If you know it already, feel free to acknowledge that in the chat. And if you want to learn more, go to that website. At this time, we want to take a second or a moment of silence, of prayer, or mindfulness in acknowledgement of our indigenous people, our indigenous community on these lands. Thank you, everyone, for taking that time. We always want to acknowledge and show gratefulness to the people that were here before and who continue to be here. We also like to take this time to acknowledge our Living Color virtual BIPOC space, which is Black, Indigenous People of Color space. We want to offer the resource in Living Color virtual BIPOC space during the conferences. They had their opening session earlier this afternoon, and they will have intermittent sessions throughout the conference. And we give our thanks to the support of the facilitators, Amanda David and Mandana Bushi, who are providing that support. And there's a link in an email if you want to get in contact with them and get registered into those sessions. The keynotes, I mentioned very briefly the keynote that I attended right before this session, which was absolutely outstanding. Laura Lindnick, if you have her book, please get that. Please go to the keynotes. The next one will be Thursday, January 21st with Banu. I hear that it's going to be a wonderful keynote. So please take your time to visit and to see some of these keynote speakers. We will have UVM note takers in the sessions. And the UVM note takers in the community map is here on the screen now. There will be 2 note takers that will be present in this session. As part of a needs assessment, notes will center on current and future priorities, opportunities, and challenges. Notes will not include any personal or identifiable information. This information will be compiled into a narrative in the coming months, open to public comments and feedback from the Northeast Seed community. And at this time, if we have those note takers in the audience in this session, I would like to ask if they could identify themselves in the chat. And we have some additional information as it relates to the seed or the needs assessment. Now, the needs assessment will take place on the 24th. We do encourage everyone to attend. That will be facilitated by Jacqueline Pilati and Hannah Traggis. And you're looking at the sessions here on this screen. So please join us on the 24th during these sessions for the needs assessment. Also, we know we have plenty of folks without means to afford conferences. Conferences can be a little pricey, whether in person or online. And we have hoped that some may have benefited from the OREI grant-supported scholarships, the SEED conference, and our UVM collaborators have been able to offer, and they were very generous. And we are so happy to offer a selection of free access SEED workshops and meetups. And you can find those and how to access it by the link that we will place in the chat. We will also place that link once again in the chat so that if you know of anyone that would like to attend these free sessions, we can get that information out to them as soon as possible so that they can partake in these. And lastly, you can use that same link to attend the Need Assessment Day, which will be on the 24th. And so thank you so much for the short time you spent with us on our introduction to the workshop. With no more from myself, I will turn everything over to Hannah Traggis, who's one of the moderators for this wonderful, wonderful session. Hannah, you can go ahead and take it away.
Hi, everybody, and good afternoon and welcome. We're really excited. It's been a really very interesting process planning all of this, and blown away. There are 81 participants already, and people still keep coming in. I want to introduce our speakers that will be sharing some of their experiences with seed work. And I will start with Bill Braun. He is a farmer at Ivory Silo Farm, and he's also the executive director and founder of the Freed Seed Federation, operating in Southeast Massachusetts. He will be presenting a story about the Rhode Island whitecap flint corn, and he will be joined by Keely Corliss, who is in the audience, and she will be contributing some of her experience working with this same corn. After Bill and Keely tell their story, Emily Rose Haga, who is the executive director of Seed Savers Exchange and a former plant breeder at Johnny's Selected Seeds. Emily will be telling a story about the Jacob cattle bean, and she will be joined by Eric Bishop-Von-Wettberg, professor at University of Vermont, and Kristen Loria, who's a graduate student doing research on this bean. Heron?
Yes, hello everybody. Give me just a moment. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is an exceptional crowd. And I'm a little blown away. I'm back in the back room here doing a little bit of Zoom tech with Anna. And so I just wanted to share with you all my thoughts as one of the volunteer organizers for this seed conference. For me, organic means a couple different things. I wanted to bring this to the forefront only because how we come here is we come to share about seed, and organic for some of us means something related to a certification, which is a third-party certification. But for me as well, I think organic can mean more things. Organic can mean a community. It can mean the seed itself that finds itself arising naturally, arising in care, and arising in stewardship organically. So when we think of an organism, or the concept of something growing and something making connections, the carbon bond, that to me is what organic is. That's the ethos that we're here today under. And I want to let you know that the beginnings of this conference happened about 7 or so years ago, or maybe it was 6 years ago. A small group of us were gathered in Saratoga Springs who were invited by Cornell University to just brainstorm about what type of things we were hoping to have bred or breed in the Northeast for what we were seeing as the challenges. And Dr. Jody Lou Smith, who was the plant breeder at High Mowing at the time, told us all we need to start having a gathering just for ourselves, just for this region. Many of us fly across the country or go elsewhere for other seed conferences, and we needed to make one for ourselves to learn from each other and with each other. So that's where this began, and we've been slowly building this, and this is our third iteration, as Anna spoke of. So thank you very much for all your patience this week and all your basically capacity to be involved. I know it's going to be a great week, and I know that none of us are going to be able to attend all of the sessions. So do what you can, share what you can. Thank you so much.
And I just want to join Heron in a little additional introduction to this session in particular, and what it means to be talking about a resilient seed community. As we know, we have all seen unprecedented things in the past year, and we have seen hunger increase at rates we never thought possible. And we see our farmers struggling to produce enough food locally to support the demand. There are a lot of limitations to what farmers can do, and one of those limitations is seed. We talk about a seed system, and as farmers, as homesteaders, as home gardeners, we're perusing seed catalogs right now and ordering seeds and planning our gardens and our farms for this coming year. And we wonder, where did those seeds come from? If anyone was trying to order seeds last year and you weren't a farmer, you were getting notices on seed company websites saying that they were not taking orders from homeowners. So we've seen a vulnerability, and that means that we need to be thinking of a stronger and more resilient system. We need a stronger, more resilient system through which we can access seeds, whether it's purchasing them or sharing them with each other. And we need a more resilient food system. And that is what we hope to be illustrating here in the session tonight, but also throughout the week, is how we can move forward and have more sovereignty over our seed and our food production in the Northeast. So at this point, I will turn the microphone and the stage over to Bill Braun.
I might just interrupt. This is Heron again. I just want to acknowledge that Dr. Fred Wiseman could not be with us today and for the week, and he has been a collaborator with us and just couldn't make it. And so if folks are finding that out at the last minute, he apologizes and we apologize. Dr. Fred Wiseman's work as an Abenaki seed worker and anthropologist are basically unparalleled in the Northeast, and folks should definitely look into his work. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, friends. Thank you for being here and for the opportunity to speak and share with you today. In the interest of my fellow presenters, I'm going to try to talk fast, but not too fast. As Hannah said, I'm a farmer in Westport, which is in the southeastern corner of coastal Massachusetts, about stone's throw from the Rhode Island border. And I'm also the co-founder and executive director of Freed Seed Federation, which you can learn more about by attending the not-for-profit seed session on Tuesday afternoon. I'm going to share a story about corn. And I recognize here amidst our community of seed keepers and wisdom keepers, there's a paradox to a male farmer of European descent delving into any history of corn. But this story is just my story, and it is unapologetically ahistorical. It's a story of resilience, a story of community, a story about corn, my great teacher, and also a story about a gristmill. Gristmill is Gray's Gristmill, which is on the border of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Gray's is one of, if not the oldest continuously operating water-powered single-stone gristmill in New England, which ranks it among the oldest in the country. Its miller, my friend George Whitley, is a walking encyclopedia when it comes to corn and mills, and takes seriously his role as a knowledge keeper of sorts. Much of my historical understanding of this corn, came from him. And his grist for the mill admonishment is, cornmeal always tastes better when taken with a grain or two of salt. And so it is that this lens will be with which we view his historical knowledge, and mine is an extension of it, in part at least, taken with a grain or two of salt. Gray's Mill's Rhode Island Johnny Cake Meal. It's done so since its inception. There are a number of folks who agree that a gristmill stood on the site prior to 1700. The first deed dates to Philip Tabor in 1717. This is to say, from the perspective of colonial time, it's been milling Johnny Cake for a while. It's through this mill that I came to know the corn. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the term Johnny Cake and its roots. It's not named after someone called Johnny, but rather as a derivative of journey cake, a food for journeying, known prior to settler colonialism by Yokeg or Nokeg. The Rhode Island Johnny Cake meal is a particular grind used to make a particular cornmeal pancake, the particular ingredients depending on where in Rhode Island you ask. So don't ask or claim to add milk in the wrong spot. Provincially, Rhode Island Johnny Cake meal is a cultural institution. This strain of corn is an 8-row, usually, cream-colored, usually, flint corn, known by a number of names today: Narragansett flint, whitecap flint, Rhode Island whitecap flint, New England whitecap flint, Johnny Cake corn among them. Archaeological investigations indicate that the first wave of agriculture reached what is now southeastern New England around 500 AD, at least. We know this because of the corn. Flint corn is traced back to Mesoamerica long before this, making it likely the oldest type of domesticated corn in the world. Back to my friend George for a second. George was recently excited to share with me his newest grind, an authentic American polenta.
Hey there, folks. Is it me?
Yes, I can hear you, Heron. And it
Okay.
sounds like Bill froze.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you too. I was afraid it was me.
Okay. How about this? How about I'm going to share some of these videos. Bill is going to come back to us. Don't worry. This is our
Perfect.
first rodeo. So Bill has actually got some videos of the grist mill on one of the slides. So we're going to share those while Bill logs back in. Okay. Give us just a second. Okay. Here's some. These are some videos that Bill brought to our for us today to look at how a grist mill operates. And bear with us while I load these. And I'm going to share that one more time, just because I know that sometimes the delay when I turn these things on isn't for everybody. Give me just a sec. And here we're going to share another video. Hopefully Bill will join us back in one moment. I'm going to bring us out from the slideshow. Has Bill rejoined us, anyone?
I'm checking.
These things happen. So I wonder, is Keely Curlis with us? I know that Keely was going to join Bill and share some of their experiences.
She is, and I just asked her to unmute her mic.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi,
Yes.
Keely.
Thank you, Keely.
I was not expecting Bill's presentation to go out like that. I was happily listening to see what he was going to say before I was hopefully going to have to talk.
He'll be back soon.
Okay. Well, I guess I can talk for a couple minutes. I don't want to talk. I don't think I would say anything that he would say because we came to the corn that he's talking about in completely different ways, and then came to meet each other actually just in this last year. So my name is Keely Curlis. I also live in Westport, down the road from Bill Braun, coincidentally. And I'm a vegetable farmer. I currently manage a farm just across the border in Rhode Island called Movement Ground Farm. But I've been farming for about 13 years, and I am a member of the Nipmuc Nation. Those of you who are not familiar with tribal territories, Nipmuc Tribal Territory is sort of central western Massachusetts, as well as dipping down into the northern parts of Connecticut and Rhode Island. Oh, awesome. It looks like Bill's back. But let's see.
Please
Bill.
continue, Keely.
Yeah?
We'll
Okay.
come back to Bill in a minute. Thank you.
Awesome. Right. So I have typically grown, mixed vegetable, CSA farm, and had not actually been involved at all in seed keeping in any sort of formal way at all during those 13 years, other than just sort of an awareness that was maybe a subgroup of other organic farmers. That was sort of my understanding, and that, tribal communities who had sort of continuous seed keeping, had really amazing programs for seed keeping within their food sovereignty projects. My tribe, unfortunately, really has not had continuous, hands on our own seed. And that's not a part of my experience working on food sovereignty within my tribe. I don't have any awareness of families that have been able to hold on seed continuously since contact. And just sort of randomly in my life, I was gifted a dream about this corn, and potentially not actually this corn, but probably this corn. This corn is the closest match to the corn that I saw in my dream. And basically, after the gift of that dream, myself and my partner began just looking for a flour or a cornmeal corn that was from this region that looked like what I had seen in my dream, and came across this corn. And we then got access to it via the germplasm database, and started tending to it and caring for it, and learning its story as best as we could. I never basically entered farming with the intent to be someone who keeps corn, and specifically keeps flint corn. But it's become clear just, through the way that my life has gone, and through that dream, that it's going to be an important part of my life from here on out. I will be talking on exactly a week from today at 10 a.m. There is an Indigenous Seed Stories panel, and I'm on that panel, and we'll talk more deeply about this corn and my relationship to it and tending to it, as well as a handful of other seeds that I feel blessed to be in relationship to now, as well as in specifics, squash that I'm new to relationship with due to the partnership and friendship now of Bill Braun, a seed that he was able to track down for me. So yeah, I will, if it's possible for it to go back to another person, I'm happy to talk more about anything in specific that maybe Bill Braun doesn't touch on. But I will also talk lots more next Saturday. So I hope you all, enjoy. And this is such a delicious and amazing corn. I feel like hopefully Bill will talk about that.
Bill, welcome back.
Thank you. Apologies. I guess that's the digital equivalent of blacking out during a talk, but my computer shut down unexpectedly as it informed me, and I'm back online. And thank you, Keely. I'm sorry I missed most of it, but I look forward to your presentation as well.
Bill, I did share your videos, albeit not as totally enlarged as just like a filler. So, but if you did want to walk folks, if at any point you want to walk folks through what we're seeing in the videos, which I did not do, that can still happen. Okay, thank you. In the interest of time, I think I'll pick up where I left off so everyone has time, and then maybe in the Q&A we can discuss what we're seeing if we have the moment. So apologies, I'm back. I think I was talking about authentic American polenta as I got blacked out. And recognizing that we live in an era where labeling anything authentic American carries some questionable connotations for a number of reasons here that I think most of us are aware. So his point here, though, I think is well taken, and for two reasons. First, this authentic American polenta grind is not grits.
which usually uses a southern dent corn through a two-stage sifting process. This polenta grind is unsifted. Second, Italian polenta is traditionally made using cornmeal from otofile, which through Dan Barber and others has ushered in a flint corn revival in some foodie circles in the US. Otofile corns are 8-row flint corns, the parents of which were brought to Italy sometime between the mid-16 and mid-1700s from New England. So, the corn that George mills comes from 3 sources. 2 of them are a farmer in Pawcatuck, Connecticut, and a farmer in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, both of whose families have been growing the corn continuously since the 1650s. Their substrains of this corn are pre-colonial. They are, in a sense, the living grandparents of all otofile. And these 2 colonial families won't sell their corn to other mills nearby. For example, closer to them than Gray's is a mill called Kenyon's Grist Mill. Kenyon's grinds are Virginia dent corn. And these Yankee farmers don't want dent and flint mixing on the stone and being labeled as flint corn. They're purists, focused singularly on keeping a tradition going. They mill for themselves and for their community. Swamp Yankees selling to their neighbors on the front porch, as George has said. They have their own networks. The 3rd farmer selling corn to Gray's, Philip, is the nephew of Harry Records of Harry Here Farm in Exeter, Rhode Island. And when you called him, he did in fact answer the phone. Harry here, hence the name. Stories of Harry could fill a book, and maybe someday they will, hopefully. But suffice to say here, industrious Yankee that he was, in the 1980s, he dusted off a seed accession that the University of Rhode Island had on the shelves as part of a corn accession preservation program, and decided to join the small Yankee circle in growing it, and to extend its range a bit, commercially and otherwise. At the time we reached out through George, Harry was, I believe, the main supplier of Gray's, milling it on farm as well and selling it to Maine Grains on and off for a few years. So in 2015, my now wonderful wife and I visited Harry Here Farm, and after a long tour, a generous plate of cornbread, and some white lightning, corn moonshine, we purchased 10 pounds of seed stock from him. Harry also showed us a yellow strain he isolated out of the Narragansett Flint, which is now known as Longfellow Yellow. His nephew Philip has continued to grow this on a commercial scale. And Harry shared, swapped, exchanged corn with a number of tribes, most frequently the Hopi, with whom he had a lasting friendship throughout his life. When he said to us, when we visited, that he was growing Hopi blue corn, he was growing blue corn from Hopi Nation. And the Hopi grew white-cap flint corn from Harry, all parties recognizing the great need for backup copies, if you will. We've been growing the corn ever since. Harry passed away in 2018, leaving the small handful of growers that are tending to this particular corn now. And unfortunately, Cassius Spears, who ran the Narragansett Tribal Farm, couldn't be here with us to share his corn story tonight. But suffice to say, in his absence, the corn has, after some twists and turns, found its way home into the caring hands of its original keepers. Our personal responsibility to Corn Teacher is, among other things, to hold space and be a backup copy in our own right, freely available to grow and can care for and be cared for in return. So a few thoughts in conclusion. The theme that's bringing us together at this conference and this session here is resilience. The case can be made, I think, that resilience is always so against the backdrop of fragility, that strength and persistence lies within the interplay of the two, of resilience and fragility. This corn, my Corn Teacher, fed First Nations for millennia pre-contact. This corn fed the English colonists who arrived at the tip of Cape Cod in the early 1600s near Truro, before Plymouth, when they found corn caches in small heaps of sand, saving them from starvation and interpreting it as divine providence. This corn's original keepers taught the colonists how to grow it, how to care for it, how to harvest it and eat it, and how to select the best seed for replanting. The success of settler colonialism, if you would call it as such, depended entirely upon native peoples and upon the corn. Peoples who even permitted the colonists in some instances early on to attend corn ceremonies. And the rest, as we know, is history. This corn has sustained humanity since the dawn of agriculture in our northeast region of Turtle Island. It has passed hands from native to non-native and back again, kept alive at times like the present by very few hands, and arguably rescued from oblivion via foodways and food culture. Yolk, Rhode Island Johnny Cake, Otofili, filet, and more recently, authentic American polenta. So how did flint corn, which has sustained portions of humanity for millennia, arrive at this precipice? In 1946, the USDA sent a survey to farmers across the country, asking in essence, what are you growing? How are you amending? What are your yields? Farmers at that time, which we can read otherwise as with today, almost exclusively white landowners, read the report that resulted from this survey, and the results were in. Dent corn yields were nearly double that of flint corn, and at reduced costs, as there's not the need to lime your fields or to fortify with calcium with dent corn the same way as flint corn. So these farmers were driven by an economic incentive. Pre-1947, there were at least 50 unique strains of flint corn throughout the United States. After this report was released, an overwhelming majority of flint corn was plowed under. Farmers switched to dent corn the next season, and here we are. Yet, at about 5 tons per year, all from these few growers, George reckons that Gray's may presently be the largest flint corn miller in the world. I'm not certain about that, but in the 2020 season of COVID, as restaurants closed their doors, Gray's other outlets for cornmeal skyrocketed. George reported that overall, 2020 sales were down 8% due entirely to the evaporation of most of their restaurant accounts overnight. But that had not happened. Had that not happened, sales this year would have been up over 20%, consistently rising from the past few years. Gray's grist mill is simultaneously responding to and creating demand for flint corn with much needed community infrastructure. Our very abridged future plans as Freed Seed Federation are to continue to maintain that strain of corn that chose us, our corn teacher, while at the same time endeavoring upon the breeding of a strain of flint corn more widely adaptable to all of the Northeast. Not because the corn needs improvement, as novel breeding might suggest, nor because we have any intention of profiting off the development of a novel strain of flint corn. I don't think any seed company that I know of is rushing to the presses with their improved variety of OP organic flint corn, but simply so that more of the Northeast can grow and be nourished and taught by the corn. And so we do our part to ensure it remains in the hands of the people. The strain of corn that we keep is hyper adapted to the coast of southeastern New England. It's about 120 days from seed. It doesn't work for others north and or west of here. In breeding a new strain, we're responding to this demand that's set forth by eaters, farmers, and some prominent agronomists. As a footnote, I trust just about anything that Heather Darby says at UVM, and it came from her mouth as well. In partnership with the legendary Carol Deppy, we'll be breeding a shorter day length flint corn for as much of the Northeast as possible to be released via the Open Source Seed Initiative, or OSSI, so that the corn will continue to feed and to teach for generations. I leave you with this. Granting that the polar force of resilience is fragility, I end the story speaking to you from the office in my house, where through the window, as the sun sets, I see through the scrub abutting the neighboring farm the stubble of genetically engineered silage corn on a wet, degraded field, which, as Westport post-colonialism was largely historically dairy land, has led to this type of corn in near ubiquity today. We have to be ever mindful, creative, and very, very careful caring for our teacher. The more of us caring for it and learning from it, the more the corn has to teach, and the more it may weave its silks into the stories of generations yet to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill and Keely. And I would we can take a minute here if anyone has questions that they want to post in the chat. I'll give people a few seconds here to post them. Otherwise, we will continue on with the next story, but we would love to take time now to answer a few questions, and there will be time later on in the session for more interaction and discussions. In the meantime, can Heron, maybe we can get Emily's presentation loaded?
Yeah, I'm all set. Let's turn it over to Emily, and it looks like the chat's empty for the moment.
Yeah.
Let's keep rolling.
Sounds good to me. Emily?
Well, hello, everybody. We're going to switch gears and talk about some bean stories next. And so my name is Emily Rose Haga. I'm the executive director of Seed Savers Exchange, which is a nonprofit in Northeast Iowa that has been since 1975 dedicated to stewarding seeds and their stories. So for this part of the session, we're going to go on another storytelling adventure, a different journey, and hear multiple seed stories that relate to some personal experiences that people have with Jacob's cattle bean. So Jacob's cattle bean is a fairly well-known heirloom bean variety in the Northeast region that I hope many of you are familiar with. It's got a long history in the region and many different stories from different people whose hands it's touched over that span of time. And so what I'd like to do is take a little bit of a different approach than Bill. We're going to do kind of a round robin with myself and 3 other folks who are going to share a bit of a multi-dimensional narrative about how Jacob's cattle bean has touched each of us, how it's informing our seed work and how we see its future. So this isn't going to be a talk where you're going to be told the answers of what makes a resilient seed community. It's really, we want to take one variety and share some of the stories behind it to challenge you to think about, you know, what resiliency looks like or doesn't look like in your work and your community. So I'm going to start out telling you my part of the story here. And it's coming through the lens of an individual experience with local and regional food traditions of New England, and also through my experience as executive director of Seed Savers Exchange. So I grew up in the Midwest, and in my family, baked beans and soup beans were a pretty big part of our food traditions, stemming from some of the New England and Appalachian roots that my family had. Heirlooms were in a way an exciting discovery for me because it allowed me to appreciate these regional traditions on a deeper level than I could just by learning the stories from my family and tasting the food in my own kitchen. It really brought more to life to me to grow and experience heirloom varieties as part of this. And so the Jacob's cattle bean for me was available in Wisconsin. And I learned about that variety and some other really beautiful and rare bean varieties from different people in my community, different gardeners, different farmers, different seed savers, people who were doing it professionally and you know, saving these varieties or experience these varieties as a hobby. So I moved to Maine in about 2012 to be a plant breeder at Johnny's Selected Seeds. And what I noticed when I moved to Maine was that the bean culture there was pretty instantly noticeable. There were pretty big signs along the side of the road that were casually spray painted with words like bean suppa. I regret not having attended one of those bean suppas in the 7 years that I lived in Maine, but what I did really appreciate about the region was that I could find a lot more heirloom varieties. The selection was greater and they were more widely available in the local food and farming scene. So I got to know heirloom varieties like Maine Yellow Eye, the Marfax bean, Lena Cisco's bird egg bean, and the Jacob's cattle bean a little bit more. So I was also excited because I got to meet a multi-generational bean farmer in Maine whose family had been producing seed of many of these heirloom varieties for generations. So I was pretty stoked to kind of experience this. And I remember sending my grandma back in Wisconsin a little care package of a bunch of heirloom beans and local honey and a postcard all about it. So fast forward 7 years later, and I moved to back to the Midwest, and I'm at the executive director at Seed Savers Exchange, and I'm excited to be with this nonprofit because their mission is kind of my jam. So my first experience when I got here was to help out at the Harvest Festival that we were hosting, and lo and behold, Jacob's Cattle Bean was the featured variety for our Harvest Festival. And my role was to help tell the story of the Jacob's Cattle Bean at the soup line, where we were having a cook-off and letting people taste different ways that it was prepared. And so my first reaction was, yes, I know this bean. I can speak to it personally. And I was really excited to learn more about its significance to Seed Savers Exchange as well. And so it turns out that the Jacob's Cattle Bean is pretty significant to the seed bank collection at Seed Savers Exchange. Today, there are over 20,000 heirloom varieties and historic varieties that represent America's garden heritage in our seed bank collection. And the Jacob's Cattle Bean is part of the origin story of the seed bank collection. So up on the screen now, you'll see a picture of John Withy, and he was a bean collector from New England who set out in the 60s and 70s to reconnect with the main bean culture traditions of his family. So he could no longer find a commercial source of Jacob's Cattle Bean at that time, even though when he was a young man working as a market farmer, it was a very common bean, and he knew it as the best bean to use in the Maine bean hole tradition, which is a method of slowly baking the beans in the ground. So he began a quest to rediscover the Jacob's Cattle Bean and find it. And this led him to discover that there were a lot of different strains of Jacob's Cattle Bean and many other heirloom beans whose fates were similarly at risk in New England. And, you know, he began traveling and advertising around New England to collect more of these at-risk varieties. And eventually he started a grassroots nonprofit called the Wanigan Associates with a group of people all across the country to help him collect and propagate these varieties. And so by 1981, he had over 1,000 different bean varieties that he collected. And he was struggling to steward them as he got older and was developing some health issues. So at that time, Seed Savers Exchange was really emerging as a leader in the heirloom seed movement with the nonprofit work that we were doing to connect different seed savers to exchange varieties all over the world. And at that point, he donated his bean collection to Seed Savers Exchange. And this would eventually lead to the creation of our public access seed bank, which is one of the most significant parts of our nonprofit mission. And so in the Seed Savers collection, Heron, if you want to kind of go forward to the slide that has the information about the strains, we have a number of different strains from John Withy of Jacob's cattle in our collection. Those are known as bean number 1, number 2, number 148, 889, 918, 1180. But we also have, you know, some additional strains in our collection that were donated to us by other members of our community that have unique or sometimes unknown histories. And so at the same time, you know, I was helping tell the Seed Savers story about this bean and its donation history. I was also happening to be reading a book by Fred Wiseman called 7 Sisters. And Fred is an Indigenous scholar who originally was going to be joining us for this session. And his book offered kind of a deeper part of the story to the Jacob's Cattle Bean than I had been aware of previously. And this part of the story was really interesting to me. He talked about a project called a Seeds of Renewal project, which is a seed rematriation project that he started in his community After discovering that the Jacobs cattle bean and many other varieties of local and regional significance potentially had Wabanaki and Abenaki origins. So he was also able, interestingly in this book, to link the bean hole supper tradition to a well-known ancient indigenous method of cooking beans in an earth oven. So despite, Jacob cattle beans popularity in the Maine bean culture and the New England canning industry, well, thanks to that, he was able to, find some personal accounts of the bean that documented its indigenous origins, having been passed down by the Passamaquoddy tribe to a white family in the Lubeck area over 200 years ago. And so Dr. Wiseman described in his book that he was motivated to keep carrying out research that would continue to recover some unimproved versions of the strain that were as close to the original source as possible, and sort of challenge the widespread academic belief that agricultural traditions were not practiced in these tribal territories. So he could help restore the Wabanaki traditions that had been lost within his culture. So for me, this combination of experiences raised a lot of pretty direct questions. First of all, I realized there are many, many layers to a story, depending on how far you peel back the onion, so to speak, that these layers have different lenses through which seeds and seed stories are collected and shared. And how far you peel that back will determine what voices and perspectives are represented, or what voices and perspectives are missing. And so it really started to get me to wonder how organizations like Seed Savers Exchange, which are frequently viewed as, an institutional pillar in the community of preserving seeds and doing historical research, how can we be helping archive and share these different stories as they emerge and continue to evolve? So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the journey that I've been on learning about the Jacobs cattle bean. And it's questioning the assumptions that I've carried and increasing my awareness of the importance of seed stories. And as I've grown this awareness, I've gotten to know some other people's seed stories, and I'm excited to have those people share those stories here with you. The first person I'm going to kick it over to is actually our moderator, Heron Breen, to talk a little bit about some anecdotes about how he's experienced this bean through the lens of the Maine bean culture and the seed industry that he's part of.
Hey folks, we'll see if my camera's working this time. And you're not missing anything if it doesn't. So thank you, Emily. That was awesome. And I guess I'm here in Central Maine, and Central Maine's kind of a surprisingly it's got a bean culture that's still alive, and some of the folks involved are 91 years old, and some of them are in their 20s, as Emily spoke to. And I grew up just kind of taking for granted, I'm 44 years old. When I was a child, there was a general store that I got dropped off at sometimes when my road was impassable from snow, and I either walked home or parents came and got me. And in that general store, there was a wood stove, pot-belly stove that we all sat around. And occasionally I pilfered some candy from that store. So, as we all do. But beans were part of everything that I saw growing up as a social endeavor. Whenever there was a church supper in town, or any kind of fundraiser, it was baked beans. And as people know the tradition, it's Saturday night. And Jacob's cattle was something that everybody would get a twinkle in their eye about, and get kind of that lick their lips kind of, yum yum kind of face. And they were very hard to come by. Even when I was growing up, even with bean culture still going on, it was kind of like, anyone know where I can get some Jacob's cattle, and folks would try to buy them by the 10 pound and 50 pound bag if they could. So as I kind of got into doing seeds, I never really thought much about beans because they were ever present. And then I started working in a seed company, Fedco Seeds. And at that point, I met a fellow named John Meter, who is the son of a plant breeder. John's also a plant breeder, but he's a son of Ellen Meter, who was sort of this well-documented and kind of unique character plant breeder over at University of New Hampshire. And John handed me a bag that said Jacob's Cattle Pike strain. And I had no idea what that meant. And it launched me on a whole story and journey. And I'm going to share some of that anecdotally with you. And this is the thing about telling stories is that, you know, I would listen to the stories that people would tell at the general store. And this is the kind of stuff that they would talk about. And I never really realized that it mattered until recently. So what turns out is that this Pike family lived in down east Maine. This pretty much goes back to the 17 and 1600s likely. And their legacy is that they were given Jacob's cattle from Passamaquoddy members when they arrived and their first child was born on native soil. And the point of that, as clear, is that your child is part of this land, and this food is part of that flesh, and we are sharing both this land and that flesh with you. Wish we had taken that seriously, but coming forward, they stewarded that giving in their particular family for hundreds of years. Now, there's a story that the actual name Jacob's Cattle comes from the biblical orientation, something to do with the color of the beans. Now, that's somewhat true because the Scots and Irish folks have this type of cattle called the Ayrshire cow that has this beautiful coloring. But what I was told is that actually the Jacob part came from a fellow named Jacob Pike, who was both a sea captain, had a ship that he traded, sailed up and down doing other things. That's basically the equivalent of a truck driver today. And he was also a well-known state legislator in the 1800s, and at the time there was a bean culture where people would trade beans. Basically every part of Maine, colonial Maine, had beans that were there's thousands of varieties in the Northeast, and there were hundreds of varieties in Maine. And because we couldn't travel as much at the time, when people did gather, they would kind of show off their beans from their area. They'd bring them in little bags or in their pockets, and they'd trade them with each other, and sometimes even trade them with each other when they were playing cards. Almost that was the betting, was you'd bet for some beans. And so the story is that Jacob's Cattle is actually named after this Jacob Pike person, and not in relation. Maybe a comic relationship, and I know we're Scots Irish folks are always into some slang, so I'm sure that the joke was understood at the time. Now, the interesting thing about this Pike family is they're kind of wild characters. Emily was mentioning that there's this, so one of the Pike fellows, how does this circle back to this John Meter or this Ellen Meter person? Well, there's this person named Radcliffe Pike, who was, I believe, the grandson of Jacob. And he ended up being a plant breeder at UNH. And he bred all kinds of wonderful things, including some rhododendrons, and became known as the expert in all of the basically flora of the down east area, Acadia, as well as the naturalist at Campobello Island. And there's actually a preserve where he had purchased some land to keep it from being ever changed. But he brought these beans apparently and shared them with Ellen Meter, Meter being also a Yankee. And those beans, if you look back at that slide that Emily showed, you can see that there was, let me just do that, that there was in that collection, let me see if I can move back. you can see that there's this whole withy strain here, and then there's this whole thing about the Heplers and UNH and this person who was the bean specialist and the Pike family from Lubeck and all these things. This Pike family has had some major role in all of this. And the stories, that the interesting thing about the Pike family is there was also one of the brothers, Sumner Pike, was involved in all sorts of intrigue and interesting stuff with Roosevelt and Truman. And there's all kinds of cool stories. There was also a turnip bred by Radcliffe and all kinds, and also a gasless bean. So they had a young member of their family that had some issues with their intestines, and they crossed Jacob's cattle with a black bean for a bean that was quicker cooking and created less gastrointestinal discomfort. So the story of this is, for me, is I'm just sharing these anecdotes because this is the type of stories that I grew up with, and that bean stories, which today every bean of all color, size, and shape has a history and has a story. And I want to also acknowledge the story that isn't part of this story, which really is what happened before the Pikes were given this bean. And so I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand this over to Eric. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Heron. And thank you, everybody. It's a wonderful to be part of such a wonderful group. I'm speaking to you from Western Abenaki land here in the Champlain Valley of Vermont. I grew up in upstate New York on Oneida land, Hamilton, New York. My parents were the hippie version of homesteaders in upstate New York. We grew a bean that looked an awful lot like a Jacob's cattle bean, but my parents had moved around a lot before going back to the land, and we never had a name for it. But I was certainly fascinated by beans as a child, even if I don't think I didn't like them, to be perfectly honest. I had the opportunity to move to Vermont about 3 years ago. I'm a ecologist by training, and a conservation geneticist by persuasion. I have been working for most of the last decade with a number of different gene banks. I do some work with the USDA germplasm collections, more with international gene banks in Ethiopia, India, Turkey. And recently, some of my work has been with the Vavilov gene bank in Russia. Nikolai Vavilov was an early 20th century geneticist and plant collector, perhaps the first large-scale systematic collector. Before he died in the Gulag in 1943, after running afoul of Stalin, he had collected nearly over 300,000 accessions of different crops. His hope was to alleviate hunger in the early Soviet Union through his collections. Being one of the first systematic collectors of crop diversity, he noted that the crops have a center of origin where they seem to have the highest level of diversity. And when he put that together with linguistic knowledge and the early field of genetics, he came up with the idea that crops were domesticated in a place and then diffused farther away. So in the case of corn or maize, Bill talked about how it arose in Mexico. Recent archaeology has put it in the Bolsas River Valley of Mexico, in Oaxaca and Guerrero. And it starts there over 10,000 years ago. And by about 1,000 years ago was here in the Northeast. Beans are known from work that Paul Gepps at UC Davis and others have done to have the unusual case of having been domesticated at least twice. Some common beans were domesticated in Mexico, where, as wonderful as Maine bean culture is, Mexican bean culture, or even regional bean culture within different parts of Mexico, to properly acknowledge it, is truly ancient and goes back to the roots of agriculture. But interestingly, agriculture also arose in Peru. We owe the potato to Peru. Beans of many types were domesticated there as well. 3 years ago, when I moved to Vermont, I learned of Fred's amazing collection. I view in many ways Fred as a teacher, although I was already a professor. And I admire what he's done in building a collection. I've put a picture of it here so we can see some of the diversity of different beans that he's collected. A few others deserve some acknowledgement. The Norwich Walk bean is also a Maine bean. Norwich Walk is on the Kennebunk River. In 1724, while the British and French settlers in what's now Maine were fighting each other with indigenous allies on each side, a massacre of a native village occurred at Norwich Walk. The story on the Norwich Walk bean is that it was found growing outside of the remains of the village several years later and has been protected since then. I admire these stories and think there can be many of them. In building a relationship with Fred, and many of us have the honor of working with him. I've seen Tony Van Winkle on this call as well, and both Tony and I are interested in helping Fred preserve these varieties by amplifying them. One of the students with Indigenous heritage in my group, Beck Morrow, was interested in extracting DNA from these beans, sending them for sequencing to answer the question that comes up with beans having two centers of origin. For reasons we can't explain, many beans from Peru are larger, kidney beans, for example, than the ones from Mexico. When the Spanish arrived in Peru, they brought beans from both Mexico and Peru back to Europe, where they began mixing. And beans that had been in Peru before, or been restricted to Peru before 1492, were then moved around the world. Fred, knowing this, has suspected, and Beck, my student, shares this, that some beans may still be fully indigenous, but may have a more complicated history, as Heron mentioned, of seeds being shared and shared and shared, and the stories growing in their complexity and their multiple ways of telling in a way that some beans may be indigenous, but have a history reflected through the movements that happened when Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas collided. My part of this story is in many ways untold. I'm looking forward to seeing Beck, who's graduated from UVM and gone on to industry. We're comparing the sequencing we've done of these 19 native beans here with a broad set from Europe, Mexico, and Peru, so that we can use genetic approaches to make inferences. We hope that those will elaborate on the story, and maybe if we do our work well, encourage others to continue to grow, save, and enjoy these beans. Kristen is going to talk about a slightly different approach to the sequencing of diversity in Jacob's cattle bean, and I'm going to pass things over to Kristen Loria at Cornell now.
All right, thanks, Eric. Hopefully you all can hear and see me. And as Eric mentioned, I'm a graduate student in plant breeding and genetics in the Mazurek lab here at Cornell University. And before returning to graduate school, I was a vegetable farmer down in the Hudson Valley area. And I had done some growing of heirloom dry beans for regional markets. And I actually first met the Jacob's cattle bean on a pilgrimage to the 2012 Common Ground Fair in Maine. It was also at the Common Ground Fair that I first experienced an authentic Maine beanhole supper, as many of us have mentioned and celebrated already this evening. And that's a tradition that I've since adopted to celebrate my own yearly bean harvest. And I highly recommend trying it out. And so I came into the Mazurk lab interested in creating dry bean varieties outside of conventional market classes that were more productive and more profitable for farmers to grow here in the Northeast. And I also hope to create varieties that got consumers excited about eating more dry beans and appreciated their diverse culinary uses. And so heirloom bean varieties like Jacob's cattle offer many things, of course, including beauty, delicious flavor, as well as potential adaptation to challenging growing environments here in the Northeast. And so starting to trial heirloom beans for that project led me to thinking about genetic diversity within land races, such as Jacob's cattle. We don't know much about the journeys that those beans have taken over hundreds of years, nor do we know how similar any of the packets of that seed that we can order out of a catalog. And so thinking about this, I applied for a SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education graduate grant to explore this question. And through connections I made via Heron in Maine, as well as the Seed Savers Exchange and the USDA Germplasm Collection, I was able to acquire about 18 different sources of Jacob's cattle or related strains that had been grown in unique locations for at least 3 seasons. And so I then took leaf samples of several plants from each of these unique sources and used genetic sequencing to measure how related they are to each other. And if we go to the next image, what you can tell from this little family tree here is that many of them were actually very distinct genetically, to the extent that you could really think of them almost as different varieties. And then, as you can see in the sort of left-hand part of the tree, many others that are highly related and essentially indistinguishable genetically. And so we assume that those perhaps have much more recent common ancestry. And so I think there's a lot of ways you could interpret and use this information, but for me, the conclusions that I came up with was that our concept of a variety is really more complex than it first might appear, especially when it comes to heirlooms and land races that have such complex histories and stories. And it also makes clear the value of these decentralized seed saving networks and land-based seed companies, and that they're preserving genetic diversity at a very fine scale, much greater than our formal germplasm collections, which only offered 2 strains of Jacob's cattle compared to the many out there, including at Seed Savers. And so the last step of this project, which I hope to do in the coming months, is to bulk together all of the seed sources that I received and grew out in the field, and send a bulked sample to each of the seed savers and farmers that sent me seed, in the hopes that they can then take that much more genetically diverse population and reselect it in their own environment. And so kind of switching gears back to the variety improvement aspect of my work here at Cornell. As I mentioned, the initial goal was to create new bean varieties for our region. And so to that end, I also crossed Jacob's cattle and a few heirloom varieties with a disease-resistant USDA kidney bean. And I have been selecting for resistance to several seed-borne pathogens that are very problematic here in the Northeast. And this is actually quite important for regional seed production in addition to just production for eating, because most of our bean seed is currently grown in the West to reduce the risk of bacterial seed-borne infection in the seed. And so the hope was that a more disease-resistant strain of Jacob's cattle or cultivar that might result from that cross would be easier to save by seed savers and farmers in the Northeast. And that would allow us to better adapt to these varieties to our region by growing them repeatedly. So the goal is to produce also a strain that is more productive, yields better, and is more profitable for farmers to grow for commercial markets so that everybody can buy that Jacob's cattle in their community and cook their own bean hole, hopefully. So of course, that being said, using heirloom varieties, especially those with indigenous connections, such as Jacob's cattle, to develop new commercial varieties raises some tough questions about who benefits from the fruits of many people's labor over many generations. And that was a question that honestly I wasn't necessarily thinking about when I started the project, but it's something that I've grappled with since. And so I think conversations like we're having right now and many more like it are really important to figuring out how plant breeding, especially formal plant breeding, can respectfully intersect with land races such as Jacob's cattle. And that does it for me. I think, am I handing it back to Emily, perhaps?
Yes, hand it over to Emily. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristen and Eric and Heron. Those were such interesting stories to hear. And, you know, I hope that this just highlighted the complexity of different stories that exist and different experiences, even around one single variety. And I think this raised a lot of good questions. Hopefully we will get into some of those questions. Maybe for the sake of time, I will kick it back though over to our moderators to decide how they want to handle the next steps.
Hannah, are you still with us? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I'm right here.
Great.
Yeah. I think at this point, there are a couple of questions in the chat. And I think we have a minute where we can maybe answer those questions. One is from Janine Sheffert. Bell and Heron have used the term Yankee in their stories. Could you define that term in the way you are using it?
Bill, do you want to take a throw at that?
Nicely done.
Oh, you know, I can ramble on. I can ramble on. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, you and I both. That's why I timed myself. I think I'm using the term Yankee as a somewhat lighthearted and playful reference to white people in the Northeast, also carrying some connotations of the industriousness with which we perceive the North as the Union and opposed to the South as the Confederacy. I don't mean it in any term, in any sense of being a derogative term. I think it's sort of a sort of playful self-referentiality. So basically, you know, I'm not someone myself who descends from original, so to speak, settler colonials, but I think it's often used in those categories, in those contexts. So I would say Yankees are have some characteristics in common. Short of words, long of thought, like to fix anything themselves, and maybe I should just stop there before it gets too out of hand. But
Yeah.
yes, it is in lighthearted and playful manner with which we use the term Yankee.
Well,
Yeah.
I would also refer people to the great literature work, How to Speak Yankee, which is also a book on tape which gives the correct pronunciations for many words and
Hiya.
also their derivations. So as we say in Maine, we know the King's English. We're just not going to hold ourselves to, we're not going to restrict ourselves just because we live in America. So, we're going to bring a lot of things. This is the type of sort of like Cockney Welsh kind of Irish stuff where we've developed our own language, which is really just an embedded element of slang. And there's a lot of different humor, sort of like Maine's famous for humor. People in Maine, we need humor. But people in Massachusetts, they don't need humor because they have jobs. That's a joke. That's an example of Maine humor.
Yeah, that's pretty Yankee. So there is a question from Lizzie Hunt that I'd like to just pose to the group, and we'll do questions. There are a couple of questions coming in, so we'll take a couple of minutes and do questions before we move on to the next session, but next portion of this session. But Lizzie Hunt asks, as a person of European descent, how can I be a respectful steward of indigenously originated seeds without colonizing those seeds? And I'll just say, Lizzie, this is such an important thing, and sharing these stories is critical, and having these discussions. We do have an entire day dedicated to giving voice to our Indigenous seed keepers, which is next Saturday. Keely Curlis alluded to that earlier, but I would ask our presenters to, if anyone has something that they want to say to touch on Lizzie's question, please speak up.
I would elevate Keely's voice as she's part of this conversation.
Yes, Keely, if you would like to help answer Lizzie's question, please do unmute yourself.
I was actually going to go ahead and I was going to say I'm going to skip on this question.
Go for it. You can skip.
Yeah, the white folks who have been seed keeping for a long time, if you all want to talk about how you grapple with that yourselves.
Yeah,
that could
definitely.
be valuable, not more valuable, but yeah, I'm going to opt out on this one.
Yeah.
This is Heron. I'm happy to go there. The answer for me is maybe at this point we can't. There's a lot of things that need to be discussed. There's a lot of people who need to listen, including myself. There's a lot of people who need to reframe seed work. That's part of what this conference and other conferences and other discussions outside of conferences are about. So the question that you've answered does not have it doesn't have an answer today. Our society is extractive, it is exploitive, both of ourselves and other folks in the world. And we are in a place in the Northeast. Many of folks are joining not from the Northeast, but we're in a place in the Northeast where we are in that place of contact. And this is where we need to do that work. If this is a relatively first place of contact, we need to be brave and start doing this work. Work on ourselves, work on what we call seed work. So I think we're gonna all need to be reflecting on that to build this community. This community needs to be everybody. And that means that, to me at least, if it means we wait to move forward on things because we don't have everybody, that's what we do. So that's what I have to say.
And speaking of community, we have a really nice comment that was entered into the chat by Breen Baldo, saying, I communicate with the community directly and listen to their perspective and ask for permission. I share revenue of seeds if that is appropriate, and continually check back in with the Indigenous communities to make sure I am on the good road. And I think, the dialogue needs to be open and it needs to be honest. And the dialogue is not always pretty and it's not always comfortable, and it's being willing to have the conversations with an open heart and an open mind, and coming from a place of sincerity. And you can start with good intentions and be open to hearing things you may or may not want to hear in response, and just listening and being receptive to that. So yeah, I think
Can I?
yes, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, Hannah.
No
Whenever
worries.
I'd just like to add also that I think what Heron said is spot on. And in addition, I think as people of European descent who are a part of this discussion and others, the first step is to show up and shut up and listen. And the second step is to understand that colonialism is attributed to people of European descent, and rightfully so. But colonialism is any mindset that's extractive and exploitative and ultimately dehumanizing. And so I think whether we're dealing with rare, endangered indigenous seeds, or we're dealing with seeds that are commercially available freely, it's imperative upon us that we understand these seeds as living beings and as the result of the care of billions of hands that came before us. And I don't think that provides us with an answer, but I think it's the appropriate livelihood to start when you're keeping seeds of any type, is in order to shed off the residue and the vestiges of colonialism, we have to approach it with a humanizing lens, and with a lens that these are beings that have cared for us and have co-evolved with us for millennia. I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I have one more other comment, which is let's stop using the word mine or
Yes.
my seeds. Let's stop for a moment with that. We don't know what that is.
Yeah.
So, whatever, there's a lot of that where, people are like, my variety, so let's take the pronouns me, mine out.
Yeah.
And that's a good place for white people to start.
So we are at time for this session, and I am not, I would like everyone to be thinking, there's a question that we posed in the description for this session. And I just want to, we've heard stories about incredible seeds, and these seeds have transferred from hand to hand and nourished family after community after region for decades, for centuries, and for millennia. And both of these seeds have been on the brink of disappearing from this world altogether. Harry Record really rescuing the Rhode Island white-capped flint corn off of the shelves of a museum. These seeds have been so close to obliteration and have found their way back into the hands of seed keepers. In and of themselves, these seeds are the embodiment of resilience, and all of these people that have held these seeds today, yesterday, tomorrow, are part of the story of the resilience of these seeds. And we want you all to think about, what do you think of when you think of a resilient seed system, and how do you look for resilience in your own work when you face challenges and seed shortages and market barriers, financial access barriers? How do you envision what can be a resilient seed system, and therefore a resilient food system and resilient communities and and regions throughout the Northeast.
Well, Hannah, I know that, so Hannah is going to be part of a panel coming up in the next about, 30 minutes from now.
29.
29 minutes, holistic botany, also with Banu Subramaniam and Zan Shako and Ken Green. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to let Hannah step out and go get prepared for that. And actually, would love to hear if, I'd love to have folks, if they can, use the raise hand function. And if somebody wants to ask a question, so this is not a time where folks, let's not spend 5 minutes in our personal diatribe, although I've been guilty of that. But I'd love to have some folks, ask some questions of Emily and Bill, and I'm sure that Eric and Kristen would also be happy to answer. So go ahead and throw a couple raised hands. That's *9 for people on the phone, and it's usually held under your reactions button on the bottom of your, or wherever your toolbar is. So
Okay.
throw up some hands, folks. And Hannah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bill and Keely, and thank you, Emily and Eric and Kristen and Heron and Anna for everything, and everyone and all of the participants. We were up to 97 participants at one point. That's absolutely amazing. I hope you all have a good conference, and I hope to see you in many sessions throughout the week and at the free needs assessment on the 24th. Don't forget, be there, raise your voice, and be part of the future of a resilient seed system in New England.
Okay.
Have a good night.
So Anna just let me know that for some reason she's struggling to open up the other meeting. So I'm going to take one question or two questions if folks have one, and then we're going to shut her down so that we can move on to the next great conversation. Does anyone have a question? I'm going to count to 10. If I don't see a hand, we're all going for a dinner break. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience today with all the technical stuff we're going to deal with over the week. Just be calm. And thank you all so much for your chat and everybody on our panel today. It's a good kickoff, and have a good evening. We'll see you soon.